Hello students, this is Mr. Sims. We are in Mod 1 on page 48, and in today's lesson we're going to talk about ratios of fractions and their unit rates. So up until this point we've really been dealing with just unit rates with, whole numbers and maybe some decimals here and there, but now we're going to start looking at problems that have fractions and decimals mixed in with the same thing occurring. So today's lesson objective, I can find and compare unit rates. And I'm going to put fractions and decimals. Right? So remember, when you find a unit rate is that constant of proportionality. Be thinking that y over x. Right? So here's an example, and we did a problem like this earlier on. I think it was like day 1 or day 2, where we talk about who is faster, who runs faster. All right? So reading for the gist at the very end, which girl is correct? During their last workout, Izzy ran 2 1/4 miles in 0.25 hours, and her friend ran 3 3/4 miles in 0.4 hours. Each girl thought she was the faster runner. Which girl was correct? So we're comparing two runners. So when we did this before, we split it into two. We got Izzy, and we got Julia. All right. So Izzy runs 2 1/4 miles in 0.25 hours. Right? And Julia, if we do miles over hours, runs 3 3/4 miles in 0.4 hours. All right. So the first thing, if you were to do these by hand, or if you're going to do these out by hand, which, with this, I don't know how many of you actually are going to do these by hand, especially seeing, some of the things that you guys do. So if you were to do this by hand, let's say we wanted to do this out, you would have to either convert the fraction to a decimal, or you'd have to convert the decimal to a fraction. Right? So meaning that maybe you make, and I think you guys work better with fractions than decimals, so maybe making this 1/4, right? And on a little post-it note here, I'm going to go ahead and do this out by hand on this. And you don't have to write this down, because I think what's going to ultimately happen is you guys are going to use this thing. I would challenge you to try to do this by hand. Okay, so if I were to do 2 1/4 divided by 1/4, okay? It's really the same as 2 1/4 divided by 1/4. Okay. Now what would have to happen is you have to get mad here. I think that's what you guys maybe remember that. And you would have to multiply. You have to make this an improper fraction, basically. So you take 4 times 2, it's going to be 9 over 4. You also would be thinking keep, change, flip. Multiply this by 4 over 1. Okay. We can do what we refer to as cross-canceling, like 4 goes into 4 once, and then this once, and you do get 9. All right, so that's being done by hand. All right, I challenge you if you would do that. But on the calculator, how to do this on the calculator? You would do 2 ABC 1 ABC 4, and then just divide it by 0.25, and you would get 9. So 9 miles per hour. All right. Okay. Then we've got Julia. Julia runs 3 3/4 miles in 4 hours. 0.4 hours. Clear? 3. Oops, that's the wrong one. 3. ABC 3. ABC again 4. That's how we do a mixed number. I think you guys already know this. Divided by 0.4. And you get 9.375. And sometimes we may have to use this as a fraction, so let's go ahead and convert this to a fraction. So if you hit the second, and then this PRB button, it brings up this fraction to decimal converter, and this is 9 3/8. Okay? So the girl that runs faster would be Julia, because 9.3 is faster. So think of a treadmill, for instance. If you're on a treadmill going 9.3 versus on a treadmill going 9. Okay? So Julia was correct. And that's all we're really doing, is just really nothing's changed. It's just fractions and decimals. All right, so here's example number 2. What is the unit rate expressed in miles per hour? Okay, here's where you got to be very, very careful. A turtle walks 7/8 of a mile in 50 minutes. Okay, so to find the turtle's rate, Meredith wrote the following complex fraction. Explain how the fraction 5/6 was obtained. Okay, so if we're doing miles per, right now we have miles and we have minutes, but we want miles and we want hours. So miles per hour. Okay. Okay. Explain how the fraction 5/6 was obtained. Right. Well, where this comes from, and actually I think what I'm going to try to do here is I'm going to, in a second here, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and pause this video and then check in with myself to see if you can figure out why. So go ahead and hit pause. All right, now that we're back, hopefully we understand that this 5/6 comes from the fact that there are 50 out of 60 minutes in an hour. So anytime you're given in minutes, you got to be very careful. And these are going to be tricky problems moving forward. So minutes, and then if we simplify this fraction, 50 over 60, okay, and actually there's a little trick with the zeros. You know, but if you divide this by 10, we get 5/6. Right. So here we've got 7/8 divided by 5/6. So if I were to do this by hand, it'd be 7/8 divided by 5/6. Keep change flip, 7/8 times 6/5. Okay. Or we can do this on a calculator. We can go 7ABC8 divided by 5ABC6, and we get 1 1/20. And this is miles per hour. Right. One last example, and this is kind of a little bit of a more challenging one. Here we go. Is there enough flour for each of his friends to get a cupcake? All right, so let's do some work. For Anthony's birthday, his mother's making cupcakes for 12 friends at his daycare. The recipe calls for 3 1/3 cups of flour, and it makes 2 1/2 dozen cookies. 2 1/2 dozen cupcakes. Anthony's mother has only 1 cup of flour. Is there enough flour for each kid to get a cupcake? All right. Okay. Cupcakes, and probably what we would look at is cupcakes per flour. Cupcakes per flour, because the number of cupcakes you make is going to depend on how much flour you got. So I could write this as 2 1/2 over 3 1/3. And we could set up a proportion, actually. And if she only has 1 cup of flour, how many dozen cookies is she going to get out of that? Okay. So we could do our cross multiplying, right? But I know 2 1/2 times 1 is just 2 1/2, and then I divide this by 3 1/3, right? Because 2 1/2 times 1, cross multiply, divide. So here we go. We'll use a calculator. So we go 2 ABC1, ABC2, oops, 2, divided by 3 ABC1, ABC3. And 3/4 of a dozen cookies. So now the question, remember, the question is, will he have enough cupcakes for his friends? Well, 3/4 of a dozen, 12 equals 1 whole dozen. So the answer to this question is no, will not. Okay. All right, so this concludes our lesson video for today. The 3 examples. Feel free to watch this over and over again as many times as it takes to understand. And I would challenge you to try to do some of this math by hand, but knowing that you do have that calculator. All right, here are the exercises that you'll be checking in with. And in terms of day 10, this is Mr. Sims signing off.